unfold.
The story of civilization is supposed to be simple, predictable, logical even.
It's the story you learned in every history class, and it's anchored by this one really powerful idea. Necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly. And that narrative, which has been the intellectual bedrock of archaeology for, almost a century?
Oh, at least. It's all built on the Neolithic Revolution model. It basically says that for humanity to move from wandering nomadism to complex society, a material prerequisite had to be met.
Farming first, temple later.
Farming first, temple later. That's the mantra. The idea is that environmental changes forced us into agriculture, which created a stable, sedentary life, which gave us a surplus of food.
And only then, with full bellies and, some free time on our hands, could we develop complex religion, monumental art, sophisticated social hierarchies.
It's a beautifully neat materialist progression. V. Gordon Childe really made that famous.
And that entire progression, that neat, tidy story, has just been absolutely pulverized by the evidence coming out of a single impossible site in southeastern Turkey.
Utterly pulverized.
Göbekli Tepe. I mean, it is, and this is without exaggeration, the archaeological thriller of the modern age.
It really is. It's a genuine chronological paradox. It forces us to just reorder the fundamental timeline of human development.
Because what we found there is this sprawling, monumental complex of megalithic stone circles. We're talking massive 20-ton structures.
And they were built by people who were still, unequivocally, hunter-gatherers.
That's the part that just breaks your brain.
It does. They built the temple before they reliably farmed, before they even had pottery to cook in.
Wait, before pottery?
Before pottery. Before they domesticated animals. I mean, think about that. They had the spiritual organization and the engineering know-how to build a cathedral, but they were still hunting gazelle herds to survive.
Okay, we have to unpack this. This is a complete historical inversion. So our mission for this deep dive is to dissect this radical evidence, this religion-first theory. We need to investigate the absolutely mind-blowing chronology, which, it establishes a sophisticated spiritual center that predates Stonehenge by millennia.
6 millennia before Stonehenge, thousands of years before the pyramids.
And we'll dive deep into the iconography, which is chilling. We're talking a skull cult, headless figures. And most importantly, we have to connect this massive spiritual endeavor directly to the origins of agriculture itself.
Because this is where the story of humanity got rewritten.
The whole revolutionary nature of Göbekli Tepe, it really just rests entirely on its age.
Absolutely. If the dating were even slightly off, it would be an interesting footnote, nothing more.
But the dates are robustly confirmed, and that, right there, is what makes this site a global phenomenon. What I find almost as incredible as the architecture itself, though, is the site's origin story. The fact that it was just sitting there, hiding in plain sight.
And it was completely missed. It's an incredible story of overlooking the obvious.
How? How do you miss something like this?
Well, the site itself is a very large, artificial-looking mound. What archaeologists call a telanon, a high limestone ridge in the Urfa region. And back in 1963, a joint survey team from the universities of Istanbul and Chicago, they investigated it.
So they were there. They saw it.
They were there. They saw the remnants of those massive T-shaped pillars sticking out of the soil. But, and this is the crucial part, in the context of the time where civilization had to follow farming, they just dismissed them completely.
What did they think they were?
They concluded they were nothing more than medieval grave markers.
Medieval?
Yes. Probably from a minor Byzantine cemetery centuries or even millennia later than the Neolithic. The thinking was that the structures were just too sophisticated for a culture that supposedly didn't exist yet in that area.
So it was a failure of imagination almost. A failure of recognition because it didn't fit the accepted model.
Exactly. And that mistake left the greatest secret of the Neolithic literally just sitting there waiting for 30 years.
Imagine being Klaus Schmidt and realizing that. Realizing that one of the most important shifts in human history was just dismissed as, medieval trash.
Well, it took his intuition in 1994 to correct the record. He visited the site, and he was keenly aware of the Neolithic potential in that wider region. But he wasn't focused on the carved stone at first. He was focused on the ground around the stone.
What did he say?
He saw the sheer, overwhelming volume of flint knappings scattering the surface. I mean, the debris, the little waste chips left behind when people make sharp stone tools.
And those were recognizable as something specific.
Oh, absolutely. He recognized them instantly as pre-pottery Neolithic artifacts. Specifically, he knew they were diagnostic of the 10th millennium BCE.
So the garbage on the ground told him more than the giant stone pillars.
In that first moment, yes. He knew then that the material beneath the surface couldn't be medieval. And that recognition led to the 1995 German Archaeological Institute excavation. The ground truth immediately confirmed his hypothesis. What they found was this incredibly deep, layered history spanning well over 1,000 years of continuous activity.
Okay, let's move directly to the stratigraphy because this is the evidence. This is what anchors the site's world-shattering claim. What did they find as they started digging down into that mound?
The stratigraphy is crystal clear, and it's really the legal evidence, so to speak, of the site's importance. Layer 1, the top one, is just the modern surface and plow disturbance. Not very interesting.
Right.
Below that, you get to layer 2. This layer contains smaller, later rectangular buildings, which show a transition in how the site was used around 8000 BCE. But the chronological shockwave, that originates from layer 3.
Layer 3 is the deepest, the oldest layer, resting right on the bedrock. And this is where the truly enormous circular enclosures were found.
Correct. Enclosures A, B, C, and D. The dating placed layer 3 firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic A era.
The PT&A. So what dates are we talking about here specifically?
We're talking about structures built between 9500 and 9000 BCE.
Let that sink in. 11,500 years ago.
And when those initial radiocarbon dates came back, the skepticism from the wider archaeological community was profound. I mean, the idea that hunter-gatherers, people supposedly just struggling for daily existence, were quarrying, moving, and erecting 15 to 20-ton stones was almost unthinkable.
Well, that skepticism is natural. You're rewriting the textbook, so if you're relying on organic material like charcoal, there's always a risk of contamination or misdating. How did the DAI team verify those dates against such extreme historical disbelief? How do you prove something is 11,500 years old with absolute certainty?
That's the key question. And they didn't rely solely on standard radiocarbon dating, though that was a crucial first step. They used a sophisticated, multi-pronged methodology. It was designed to scientifically lock in the dates of the massive stone pillars themselves. And one of the most compelling verification methods involved a geological process known as pedogenic carbonates.
Okay, you have to stop me there. Pedogenic carbonates. Can you explain that in simple terms for us?
I can. Think of limestone as a rock that dissolves just a little bit in water, releasing calcium carbonate.
Okay.
Now, when you erect a massive limestone pillar and then it gets buried in soil over thousands of years, that calcium carbonate gradually precipitates out of the soil water. And it starts accumulating in these fine microscopic layers on the surface of the stone itself. It creates a kind of geological rind.
Oh, like a slow buildup, sort of like the process that forms stalactites in a cave.
Precisely. A very similar idea, but on the surface of the buried stone. Now, the crucial step is that by dating the oldest accumulation of these carbonates, the very first layer resting directly on the stone, they established a firm terminus antiquem for the pillars.
Terminus antiquem, which means a date before which the pillars absolutely must have been standing.
Exactly. If that carbonate layer is dated to, say, 9000 DCE, the pillar had to have been standing long enough for the soil to bury it by 9000 BCE.
So it's a geological clock. It's a double check.
A very powerful one. And it's strongly corroborated the incredible antiquity of the Layer 3 enclosures. But even then, to remove any doubt, they performed direct radiocarbon dating on tiny organic residues they found embedded in the wall blaster of enclosure D.
And the results?
Those results clustered exactly around 9500 BCE. The science was watertight. These structures are 11,500 years old, period.
That is just staggering. I mean, we are talking about structures that are about 6 millennia older than the oldest phases of Stonehenge, 5 millennia older than the earliest attempts at writing. It just fundamentally shatters our preconceived notions of what a community in the 10th millennium BCE was capable of.
Socially, technologically, in every way. And to truly understand how they managed this colossal feat, we need to talk about the context of the land, because the builders weren't fighting the environment, they were being supported by it.
Right, because if you visit the Urfa region today, it's pretty semi-arid, often treeless, and it looks like a difficult place to scrape out a living.
Very different from how it was 11,500 years ago. This period, the beginning of the Holocene, followed a really turbulent climatic event known as the Younger Dryas.
Can you just quickly contextualize the Younger Dryas for our listeners?
Of course. The Younger Dryas was a brief but very dramatic return to near glacial ice age conditions. It abruptly interrupted the post-Ice Age warming trend, lasted for roughly 1,200 years, and created immense stress on populations globally.
A mini ice age,
A
basically.
mini ice age. But when the climate finally stabilized and warmed up again, the Urfa region, where Göbekli Tepe is, experienced a radical boom.
So as the ice retreated, this specific area became a kind of biological refuge, a climatic sweet spot.
Absolutely. Pollen analysis, the zooarchaeological records,
Mm.
they all paint this vivid picture of a rich, biologically diverse steppe environment. It was watered by seasonal rains and dotted with gallery forests of nutritious trees like wild pistachio, almond, and oak.
This was a place of abundance, a veritable Garden of Eden for hunter-gatherers.
It really was.
Yeah.
So they weren't struggling. The environment was actually providing them with this massive, reliable caloric safety net that freed up labor.
And that is the crucial implication. The evidence shows not only vast stands of wild cereals, the ancestors of modern wheat, but also huge herds of wild game, particularly gazelle, numbering in the tens of thousands during their migration.
So the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not the desperate, starving nomads of the old narrative.
No. They were affluent hunter-gatherers, supported by an unprecedented natural caloric surplus, and this allowed them to designate surplus labor, a workforce potentially numbering in the hundreds, to purely ideological or religious construction long before the demands of farming ever tied them down.
They built the temple because the natural abundance meant they could afford to.
Okay, the logistics of Layer 3 are almost impossible to wrap your head around.
They are.
These were hunter-gatherers, but they were acting like pharaohs. They had no metal tools for cutting, no wheels for transport, no domesticated beasts of burden for pulling, yet they erected monolithic limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons.
And that's not even the biggest. The unfinished largest pillar still in the quarry is estimated to weigh 50 tons.
50 tons! What's a good comparison? That's like the weight of a fully loaded semi-truck. How do we explain the sheer engineering effort?
It required a monumental collective effort that just redefined Stone Age logistics. The pillars are made of hard Urfa limestone, quarried from the plateau surrounding the site, often less than a kilometer away. But moving a single block weighing 50 tons requires coordination and management and ideological motivation on a scale we just didn't think existed back then.
So that 50-ton block, how did they even begin to get something that massive out of the living bedrock in the first place, using only stone tools?
The evidence in the quarries shows they used simple but very persistent technology. Workers used heavy, blunt stone hammers and sharp flint picks to carve these deep, wide channels into the bedrock, isolating the block they wanted.
So just chipping away endlessly.
Endlessly. And to break the block free from the quarry floor, they often exploited leverage and natural forces.
This would be the wooden wedge technique.
Exactly. They'd drive wooden wedges into fissures that they'd carved beneath the block. Then they'd soak the wedges with water. As the wood expands, the immense hydraulic pressure generated would literally split the rock free.
It's incredibly labor-intensive, but it works.
Highly effective for splitting large amounts of hard rock. But, as you say, once it's free, the real logistical challenge begins. Moving those 15 to 20-ton central pillars over hundreds of meters to the hilltop site.
And this tells us less about physics and more about society, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. This was not the work of a few extended families. Moving those weights required the simultaneous, coordinated effort of hundreds of individuals. Pulling the megaliths likely across rolling logs, or using sledges on prepared surfaces. This demands a complex social hierarchy, or at the very least, an extremely powerful unifying ideological system. Something that convinced hundreds of men to designate their caloric surplus in their time to building a house for the gods rather than, hunting or foraging.
It's physical proof of sophisticated social organization before the state, all fueled by shared belief.
Precisely.
Let's look at the centerpiece of this engineering, Enclosure D. It's the archetype for the whole site. If you were standing in the middle of it 11,500 years ago, what would you have experienced?
You would have experienced the power of presence and of scale. Enclosure D is the most spectacular and best preserved structure from Layer 3. It's about 20 meters in diameter, enclosed by a rough stone wall.
But your attention is immediately drawn to the 13 colossal T-pillars that define the space.
Especially the two central monoliths.
The central giants, that's Pillar 18 and Pillar 31. Give us a sense of their scale again, for those visualizing this.
They are magnificent. They stand approximately 5.5 meters tall. That's about 18 feet. Each one weighs between 15 and 20 tons. And crucially, they aren't just placed on the ground.
No.
They are set into these carefully carved pedestals that are rooted directly into the living bedrock of the hilltop. And then the bedrock itself was smoothed to form the enclosure floor.
So it's all integrated. This isn't casual building. This is deliberate, highly sacred architecture.
The precision and the scale confirm that Enclosure D was the primary defining stage for the most sacred rituals of that entire community.
Now, the T-pillars are the site's signature. It's easy to look at them as abstract shapes, but they represent a human form. They are, in essence, faceless giants.
They're classic anthropomorphic abstractions. The T-shape functions as a stylized human figure. The horizontal crossbar is the head, often tilted slightly forward, and the vertical shaft is the body.
And we know this because of the carvings.
The intricate relief carvings, yes.
Yeah.
They're most explicit on Pillar 18.
What specific details make it so clear that this is a person, or at least a powerful entity?
The carving is subtle, but it's unmistakable. On the broad sides of the shaft, you see arms carved in low relief bent at the elbow. Then hands, often depicted with these long, spindly fingers, reach around the narrow sides of the pillar, meeting at the front, resting on the stomach area.
And below the hands, there are details of clothing.
A belt and a very distinct loincloth.
And that loincloth is specifically identified as a fox pelt, right?
Yes, a stylized fox pelt. And that detail is so specific, so rooted in the local fauna and the hunter's world, that it anchors these abstract giants in the reality of their builders. These are not random shapes. They are powerful ancestors or spiritual entities, or perhaps the very first gods, endowed with the strength and protection of the wild.
What does that facelessness convey, though, especially when you combine it with the scale and the power implied by that fox pelt?
The facelessness is terrifying. It's imposing. It suggests they're primordial beyond individual recognition, representing a collective force or a generalized powerful ancestor figure. And the arrangement reinforces this.
How so?
The smaller perimeter pillars standing against the wall, they all appear to be oriented or looking inward toward the two central giants.
Oh, wow.
It creates this dynamic scene, like a gathering or a council or an audience with two superior entities. It's a physical manifestation that likely reflects a complex hierarchy within their spiritual realm.
Which in turn mandated the cooperation and organization of the human community below, a spiritual power structure dictating social cooperation.
Yeah.
That's a huge idea.
It is.
Now, these colossal circles define Layer 3, but they eventually stopped being built. Around 8000 BCE, we see this distinct architectural shift to Layer 2. What happened?
This transition, it happens roughly coinciding with the final stages of the PPNA and the move into the PPMB, the pre-pottery Neolithic B era.
Right.
And it marks a significant social reorganization.
Okay.
The practice of building those immense communal circular enclosures just ceased. Instead, we see the construction of much smaller rectangular buildings. They appear to have been partially roofed. A famous example is the Lion Pillar building.
So the architecture changes from these huge, round, collective structures to smaller, angular, more contained rooms.
Exactly. Layer 2 features much smaller T-pillars, maybe only 1.5 meters high. But they also have sophisticated new architectural elements, like carefully crafted terrazzo floors made of burnt lime.
But the sheer effort of Layer 3 is gone. The size reduction is undeniable. Does this suggest a decline, a loss of organizational capacity or belief?
Not necessarily a collapse. The persistence of the T-pillar form, even in miniature, confirms the continuity of the core belief system. They still believe in these entities.
But something has changed.
The shift is indicative of a social change. Layer 3's massive circles, they require the coordinated effort of many different, possibly super-tribal groups. Hundreds of people drawn from a wide region.
Okay.
Layer 2's smaller rectangular rooms suggest a move toward more localized rituals, maybe lineage-based or clan-specific. Perhaps that vast intergroup unity needed to build Layer 3 was just no longer sustainable or necessary once farming became a more localized activity.
So the spiritual demands adapted, the physical scale shrunk, and the community shifted from this big super tribal unity to smaller, maybe family or clan-based units. And it's all reflected in the blueprints they left behind.
If the architecture tells us about the physical structure of their society, communal versus lineage, then the iconography is the window into the structure of their minds.
And the visual language of Göbekli Tepe is dark, it's primal, and it's totally focused on the wild world they were masters of.
Exactly. We are not seeing scenes of domestic life or gentle animals or the harvest here.
No. The absence of domesticity is really striking. There are almost no female figures depicted and certainly no scenes of agriculture. The iconography is overwhelmingly masculine, aggressive, and focused on the dangerous animals of the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 range.
Which animals dominate this artistic universe?
The statistical analysis of the reliefs shows a clear hierarchy. You have snakes, foxes, wild boars, leopards, and large birds like vultures. And the sheer number of carvings is massive, often depicted in high relief, which makes them seem to almost jump off the stone.
Let's start with the snakes. They're frequently depicted writhing across the pillars, sometimes in these dense, tangled groups.
Snakes, in the context of the Neolithic Near East, are potent chthonic symbols.
Hold on, for listeners less familiar with that term, what does chthonic mean in this context?
Chthonic refers to the deities or the spirits of the underworld. So snakes are associated with the earth, the darkness beneath the ground, and by extension, cyclical concepts like death, rebirth, and regeneration.
So the sheer number of snakes suggests a deep concern with forces below the surface, the source of life and death.
Precisely. The fox, however, is the most common mammal depicted. It appears either alone or as part of the T-pillar's clothing, as we mentioned. This suggests it may have been a really significant tribal totem, or maybe a trickster figure.
And the wild boars, the leopards, the lions.
They represent raw, untamed power and aggression. These are the animals that required the highest hunting skill and posed the greatest danger.
So seeing these creatures on the pillars, sometimes being gripped or held by the anthropomorphic figures, it suggests a religion centered on controlling or harnessing or maybe just appeasing the violent, unpredictable forces of the wild.
It's an ideology built on hunter-gatherer survival and dominance. And nothing captures the complexity and the darkness of this ideology quite like Pillar 43, the famous Vulture Stone in Enclosure D.
This panel is so detailed, it's been interpreted as everything from a funeral scene to a cosmic warning from the past.
Describe it for us. What do we see on Pillar 43?
It's intensely complex, an almost narrative tableau. On the west face, the scene is dominated by this huge vulture with one wing raised, and it's positioned above a critical assembly of figures.
Okay.
There's a distinct sphere or disc above the vulture's wing. Below that, you see a scorpion and various other waterfowl like cranes or ibises.
And then there's the central figure that generates so much interpretation.
Yes, the focus figure is a headless human. It's carved with striking detail, and importantly, he is distinctly athephalic.
Meaning he's depicted with an erection?
Correct. And the entire scene is framed by three recurring symbols along the top edge. These rectangular shapes with arched handles, now popularly nicknamed the handbag symbols, each one is surmounted by a small animal motif.
Okay, there's a lot going on there. Let's look at the established interpretation first, the one that aligns with local customs and is accepted by the excavators, the sky burial theory.
Interpretation A connects the dots within the local cultural context. The combination of vultures, which are known for scavenging, and a headless corpse points very strongly to the Neolithic practice of excarnation.
Excarnation.
This is where bodies were exposed outside the settlement, left for birds and weather to deflesh them. It was a way of purifying the remains before a secondary burial or processing of the bones.
So in this reading, the vulture is the psychopomp, the soul guide.
The soul guide, exactly. And the sphere above the vulture's wing represents the soul, or critically, the severed head of the deceased being carried toward the sky.
And the headless athephalic man is the deceased ancestor, the erection symbolizing that final regenerative vitality in death, a defiance of mortality.
It's a very widespread ancient trope.
Yeah.
And this reading is powerful because it explains the iconography using practices that are confirmed across Neolithic Anatolia and the Levant. It fits the context.
But then we have the high drama counter theory, interpretation B, the one that really captures the public imagination, the astronomical warning championed by people like Martin Sweatman.
Right.
Why is this theory so compelling to non-archaeologists? What's its core claim?
Its core claim is one of advanced intellectual sophistication. Sweatman argues that the animals on Pillar 43 are not local fauna at all, but rather representations of specific constellations. He sees the whole scene as a sophisticated mnemonic device, a stone date stamp.
So the vulture is a constellation.
He interprets the vulture as the constellation Cygnus, or maybe Lyra, the scorpion is Scorpius. The claim is that the placement of these symbols records a precise cosmic event.
And that event is specifically the impact of a comet that supposedly triggered the Younger Dryas cooling event around 10,950 BCE.
That's right. He posits that the three handbag symbols represent key solar points, like solstices and equinoxes, and that the overall scene maps to a specific celestial alignment that only occurred at that catastrophic date.
It's an incredible idea. It suggests these supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers were actually sophisticated astronomers recording a global disaster.
The appeal is immense. It sounds like an advanced message in stone, left for future generations.
But why do mainstream archaeologists view this theory with such strong skepticism?
The skepticism really stems from archaeological rigor. Firstly, the theory requires a lot of selective interpretation. You have to cherry-pick constellations that happen to align with your proposed date, while ignoring the overwhelming cultural context of excarnation and the fact that the pillars primarily depict local animals that were central to their survival.
The simplest explanation is usually the best one.
And secondly, the astronomical correlation is often stretched to fit the desired date. So archaeologists prioritize the strong, established cultural context, the Neolithic death cult over cosmological speculation that lacks any direct corroboration from other site evidence.
So the headless man is much more likely a reference to the very real practice of skull removal than it is a metaphor for global extinction.
Exactly. And that takes us to the most unsettling, macabre part of the evidence: the physical confirmation of the skull cult.
For years, the absence of standard burials at the site was a huge mystery. But the answer wasn't that they weren't buried, it was that they were processed.
Yes, recent osteological analysis provided the smoking gun confirming the dark side of this ideology. A team of researchers, Julia Gresky, Julianne Helm, and Lee Clare, recovered fragments of 3 human skulls from the enclosure fill, and these fragments showed clear, unmistakable signs of intentional modification.
Modifications that could only have been performed post-mortem.
Correct.
What were they? We're talking about more than just defleshing, right?
Oh, much more. They identified 3 crucial types of modification. First, yes, there were distinct defleshing marks. Scrape marks consistent with flint tools being used to remove muscle and tissue. So the skulls were actively processed.
Okay.
Second, they found deep incisions. Straight, intentional grooves carved along the sagittal axis. That's the line running from the forehead to the back of the skull.
And what would be the purpose of those incisions? Just decoration?
Potentially, but the leading hypothesis suggests function. These grooves were likely carved to stabilize or seat a cord or some kind of binding material, maybe a cradle for decorative pigments or clay. But the third modification is the most telling.
What's that?
Drill perforations.
The hole drilled in the skull.
A carefully drilled hole at the top of the parietal bone. And the location and the careful nature of this hole, combined with those incisions, led the DAI team to a chilling conclusion.
Which was?
These skulls were modified to be suspended. The drill hole allowed a cord to be threaded through, and the deep incisions would prevent that cord from slipping, ensuring the skull remained upright and secure when it was hanging.
So we have to imagine Enclosure D, this masterpiece of Layer 3, not just as a gallery of huge stone beasts and abstract giants, but as a ritual space possibly festooned with hanging, decorated human skulls.
That is the compelling implication. These were probably skulls of revered ancestors, or perhaps even trophy skulls of powerful enemies, displayed for some ritual or social purpose.
And this practice aligns perfectly with the headless man iconography on Pillar 43.
Perfectly. And with the emphasis on death and renewal, and even the discovery of statues at related sites in the region that depict figures holding or cradling heads, the skull cult was a mechanism of memory, of power, of ritual continuity, physically anchoring the group's identity to the remains of the dead. It is incredibly sophisticated, intense, and deeply macabre.
So we've established that Göbekli Tepe was built by these sophisticated, affluent hunter-gatherers, driven by a demanding, complex, and sometimes terrifying theology. But the fundamental question remains: how do you sustain the continuous, massive labor required to build a 20-ton stone temple complex if you're not relying on organized farming?
You don't just sustain them, you pay them. You pay them in a medium they value. You feast them.
Right.
The refined feasting hypothesis suggests that the sheer logistical demands of constructing these temples, specifically the need for these intense, scheduled labor gatherings to move stones and erect pillars, that this was the original force that drove agricultural innovation.
The spiritual demands created an economic necessity.
Exactly.
Okay, let's look at the evidence for these massive feasts. What does the zooarchaeological record tell us about what was on the menu?
The caloric receipt is enormous. Archaeologists have recovered literally tens of thousands of animal bones from the site, and the overwhelming majority, over 60% of the identifiable fauna, belong to a single species, the goitered gazelle.
60%. That's not small-scale opportunistic hunting. That concentration suggests industrial-scale procurement, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The animals were hunted during their massive seasonal migrations, which typically occurred between midsummer and autumn across the nearby Heron Plain. This required massive, coordinated communal hunts. We're talking hundreds of people working in unison, far exceeding what a small subsistence group could ever manage.
And how did they manage to capture that much game so reliably?
They used a sophisticated humping technology that predates settled life, so-called desert kites.
Desert kites.
These were massive structures, sometimes running for miles, consisting of low stone walls built in funnel shapes. Hunters would drive huge herds of gazelle into the wide end of the funnel, which then narrowed into a killing pit or a corral.
And the volume of gazelle bones found at Göbekli Tepe confirms that these communal hunts, dictated by the schedule of temple building, provided the staggering amount of protein needed for the feasts.
It does. But the feasts required an immense, reliable supply of not just meat, but also calories from plants. And this brings us to the famous beer before bread hypothesis.
This is one of the most compelling insights from the site.
It really is. The evidence suggests that the initial intensive harvesting of wild grains was motivated not by a desire to bake unleavened bread, which is arduous and not very exciting,
Right.
but to brew a high-calorie, psychoactive substance for communal ecstatic rituals.
What's the physical evidence for large-scale brewing at the site?
Within the Layer 3 enclosures, archaeologists recovered 6 enormous barrel or trough-shaped limestone vessels.
These aren't drinking cups.
No, these are massive vats, some with capacities exceeding 160 liters each. Imagine a large modern bathtub carved from a single piece of limestone. They were found right in place, associated with grinding tools.
That is industrial-scale fermentation. Did they find any chemical proof inside them?
Crucially, yes. Residue analysis of the gray-black material adhering to the interior of these vessels provided the chemical smoking gun. They identified high concentrations of calcium oxalate,
Calcium oxalate.
which is the principal component of what brewers call beer stone.
Beer stone.
It's a definitive byproduct formed when barley or wheat is fermented. This confirms, beyond a reasonable doubt, that these vats were used for large-scale brewing.
So the implication is clear. The initial motivation for managing grain was to fuel these massive ritual gatherings, providing a high-calorie reward and maybe an altered state of consciousness that was central to the collective religious experience.
The beer served multiple functions. It was sustenance, it was a social lubricant that cemented the required cooperation between different groups, and it was a ritual agent that bonded them to their spiritual entities.
So the temple work feasts created an industrial demand for a reliable, storable surplus of grain just to keep those 160-liter vats full.
And that ritual demand required an equally industrial capacity for processing the grain, even before it was domesticated.
What's the evidence for that?
The sheer volume of processing tools recovered is just astonishing. Over 7,000 grinding tools, handstones, pestles, mortars, have been recovered from the site. This density of equipment is far beyond what any subsistence household or small group would ever require. It signifies a specialized, centralized processing system.
So this relentless, non-negotiable demand for processed grain year after year, feast after feast, created a powerful selective pressure on the wild plants.
It did. And that brings us to the genetic smoking gun that connects the temple directly to the single greatest invention in human history, the invention of farming.
This is the definitive causal loop.
It is. Genetic analysis by researchers like Manfred Hunn traced the origin of domesticated einkorn wheat, Triticum monococcum, to one specific location where the wild ancestor first mutated. And that location is the 𝐏𝐃𝐂𝐃𝐂𝐃 mountain range.
And how far is 𝐏𝐃𝐃𝐂𝐃𝐂𝐃𝐂𝐃 from Göbekli Tepe?
It's only 30 kilometers away, about 20 miles.
That's right on the doorstep.
And furthermore, the genetic divergence, the point at which domesticated einkorn became genetically distinct from its wild ancestor, coincides precisely with the time frame of the PPNA occupation, between 9500 and 9000 BCE.
So the people building Göbekli Tepe were absolutely harvesting the wild cereals on 𝐏𝐃𝐃𝐂𝐃𝐂𝐃 to supply their massive beer vats.
They were. And the crucial factor is that their intense, ritual-driven harvesting created the selective pressure necessary for domestication. When you intensively harvest wild grain, you naturally select for the plants that are easiest to harvest.
Right.
Wild cereals have a fragile stem called a shattering rachis, which breaks easily when it's ripe, scattering the seeds everywhere. The mutation that produces a non-shattering rachis, a tough stem that holds the seed onto the plant, is a defect in nature, but a highly desirable trait for humans.
Because if the stem doesn't shatter, you can collect the whole head of grain without losing all the seeds on the ground.
Precisely. So the people supplying the temple, driven by this intense, continuous demand for ritual surplus, unconsciously selected and replanted the mutants with the tough Rachis. This wasn't a calculated economic decision to settle down.
No, it was the unintentional byproduct of spiritual necessity.
The temple forced the innovation of the plow.
As is common with sites that completely revolutionize history, Göbekli Tepe has acquired certain, let's say, romanticized ideas over the years.
That's putting it mildly.
And current, meticulous research by the DAI team is helping us move past these myths to a more grounded, more nuanced reality.
It is.
One of the earliest, most powerful ideas was championed by the original excavator, Klaus Schmidt. The idea that Göbekli Tepe was a vacant temple.
A pure sanctuary with no permanent residential population. The idea was that it was just a ceremonial pilgrimage site.
But that view has largely been overturned, hasn't it?
It has. While it was certainly a pilgrimage center, recent excavations confirmed that a permanent population did, in fact, live on the mound, at least during the intensive construction and use phases of Layer 3. They found clear evidence of domestic structures, smaller, rectangular buildings with central hearths right alongside the monumental architecture.
So it wasn't just a place people visited for a week of feasting and building. It was a settled community that lived there year-round, managing the temple.
Absolutely. And this permanence, especially on a dry limestone ridge, required incredible, complex logistical engineering for survival. They had to solve the water problem.
Which is arguably as monumental an achievement as moving the 20-ton pillars.
I would say so. They designed and carved channels directly into the limestone plateau to direct rainwater runoff. And these channels fed into massive bottle-shaped cisterns.
How big are we talking?
These storage vessels, carved underground, had estimated capacities exceeding 150 cubic meters.
150 cubic meters. For listeners visualizing that, that's equivalent to about a dozen small family swimming pools. That's a massive amount of water storage.
It is. This level of planning and hydraulic engineering proves long-term investment, not just sporadic visits. It confirms the sustained logistical capacity required to support a permanent population on a difficult hilltop site. They literally harvested the sky to ensure their survival and the smooth operation of the temple complex.
Okay, now let's tackle the biggest piece of romanticism surrounding the site. The idea of the ritual burial. It's a great story, but is it accurate?
The initial narrative was incredibly dramatic. The idea was that around 8000 BCE, the creators of Göbekli Tepe deliberately and rapidly backfilled their magnificent temples with millions of tons of stone and rubble. They consciously decommissioned the site, leaving a pristine time capsule for the future.
It sounds like a grand unified closing ceremony, a very profound act.
It does. But the current DAI team, led by 𝐏𝐿𝐴, has meticulously challenged this interpretation using rigorous geological analysis. If the fill had been a single, intentional, rapid burial event, you'd expect a uniform deposit, clean soil, or rubble. Instead, analysis shows the fill is highly heterogeneous. It's a messy mix of rubble, flint artifacts, bone fragments, and eroded soil, with clear signs of natural geological activity happening within the layers.
So what's the revised, more realistic theory for the site's abandonment based on the physical evidence?
Well, the site is built on a slope, and this slope was inherently unstable, especially after all that major construction. The researchers concluded that the burial was largely a slow, messy process of inundation resulting from slope slide events and erosion.
So mudslides, basically.
Essentially, yes. As the monumental enclosures fell into disuse or their temporary roofs collapsed, debris from the higher parts of the mound just naturally washed down, accelerated by rain and gravity, and it eventually filled the lower depressions.
So it suggests the brilliant engineers who moved 20-ton stones were ultimately defeated by gravity and bad weather, not a spiritual decision to bury their own works.
Exactly. And the evidence even suggests the inhabitants were actively trying to fight this natural decline. They found remnants of retaining walls, suggesting the community was constantly trying to mitigate the slides and hold back the encroaching soil.
So the abandonment was a long, messy process of decline and maintenance failure driven by natural forces.
Not a pristine, unified ritual closure. It strips away some of the mystery of the time capsule myth, but it adds a kind of tragic realism to the final years in the temple.
This deep dive into Göbekli Tepe has forced us to completely abandon the idea of the primitive hunter-gatherer. At 9500 BCE, humans possessed a sophisticated, demanding, and often terrifying theology that drove them to move mountains and redefine their relationship with nature.
Let's quickly synthesize the core findings that really inverted that historical timeline. First, the dating is conclusive. 9,500 BCE, firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic A, that is a fact. Second, the causality is inverted, religion first. The feasting hypothesis proves that the intense pressure to supply ritual surplus for beer, for massive communal hunts, created the industrial demand that forced the unintentional invention of farming.
And that's verified by the genetic birthplace of einkorn wheat being only 30 kilometers away.
The smoking gun. And finally, the terrifying ideology revealed in the iconography is just so intense. The Vulture Stone and the forensic evidence of the skull cult tell us this was a society deeply concerned with death, ancestor memory, and the appeasement of the wild, untamed forces that govern their existence.
The profound realization here, for me at least, is that the foundation of the Neolithic Revolution was not material, it was mental.
I think that's exactly right. Before humanity bent the earth to the plow, they first bent hard limestone to their spiritual will to create a house for the gods. Göbekli Tepe was the necessary laboratory where complex, large-scale civilization began, fueled by an ambition that transcended mere economic necessity.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over. If sophisticated, demanding theology and monumental ambition existed before the basic economic security of settled farming, what fundamental human need was truly the first engine of large-scale social organization? Perhaps the need to belong and believe.
The inherent human need for shared meaning, for ritual, for a collective identity anchored by spiritual power.
Maybe that is even more foundational to human society than the simple material need for bread.
The greatest invention in human history might not have been born of calculated survival, but of spiritual desperation. And that's a profound thought to take away from the ancient windswept ridges of the Anatolian steppe.